Hello again, this is Ester. Today I want to talk about something a little bit different. Most of this podcast is going to be covering the competitive format and circuit that is Metazoo Towers. However, if you're like me, despite being in a large city, there's not much of a local Metazoo scene, which can make it difficult to find people to play test with, and it means that you're probably only going to be able to play in person at these tower events once a month if you're lucky enough to be able to travel to them. I've been trying to work on a cure for this, an easy, inexpensive onboarding format that utilizes all of the good stuff in Metazoo and is friendly to the casual experience. Now, if you've hung out at card shops at all in the last handful of years, you're probably familiar with Magic the Gathering's Commander format. Commander, otherwise known as EDH, aka Elder Dragon Highlander, is most of the time a casual format and one of the most popular ways to play Magic, in which you pick a commander card, which has to be a legendary creature in the game, and build a 99 card deck based around that commander. The game is generally played with 4 players and allows for a large interactive experience. It really leans into Magic's mechanics and the interesting interactions that can happen without being a competitive format. The goal is not usually to build the best commander deck. The goal is to build the best commander deck for your chosen strategy and your commander. And Commander has a lot of culture that I think is useful to take into a casual format. Namely, people generally avoid what's called a good stuff deck. If you're playing a red commander, a red deck, you could just put the 99 best red cards in that deck. That would be a good stuff deck. It's not necessarily interacting or caring about your commander. You can do it, it's kind of considered bad manners. In other words, it's not really in the spirit of the game. The first step to get into Commander usually involves buying a pre-constructed deck. A pre-constructed Commander deck that you can then take, 10, 20 singles as you get them and swap out to make your deck more efficient and customized to your experience. And more than anything, Commander players are generally down to game with other people. They'll go to tables because a Commander table is for players. It's a good community building format. And it just so happens that Commander is extremely popular in all of my local shops. So ideally, I want to onboard some of those players to Metazoo because I do think they would really enjoy the game. Now, you've probably handed a prospective player a couple of competitive decks and played against them, and after a few games, they probably understood the various mechanics and were able to play. And, maybe they liked it, but they probably didn't understand why they were playing the deck they were playing because they didn't understand the greater meta. That also creates a kind of difficult experience when it comes to getting that player to think for themselves and make their own decisions within the game. It's not their deck, it's this tournament deck, right? And it is a deck that's meant to play well in a constructed environment that they don't understand. Chances are, unless they're playing something like Fearsome Critters, they're not going to easily be able to go out and obtain all of those cards for themselves because they're not going to have the knowledge or the context for it. Another problem I have, and this is just a personal gripe, is there are so many amazing designs in Metazoo that just aren't competitively viable. And specifically, I'm talking about the theme and release deck face cards, aka Boss Beasties. Now, I don't know if Boss Beasties is still the used term, but at the start of the game, they were Boss Beasties. That was an appeal, is you could go to a release event, you would get one of these release event decks, and you would get 1 out of 5 exclusive cards to those decks with a deck built around it. As a collector, when you are opening a booster box and trying to fill out a binder, the idea that there's these 5 Boss Beasties to chase that you can build a deck around is a very attractive prospect. And yet, when you get into the big game, most of these cards just aren't played, despite having really interesting mechanics. Sure, you're going to see Flying Manta Ray, Reptoid Ruler, and a very popular card, Gassian Ditha. Ditha? You tell me. But cards like Morgana, Manchac Swamp Priestess, and Black Knight Satellite are less likely to see play. Taking all of this in mind, I think there is a way to take the existing culture, if not the mechanics, from Magic's Commander, and apply it to Metazoo in a way that allows us to play with all of these cards, in a way that is friendly to the local game store, in a way that is inexpensive for college students or people who are building on a budget, and in a way that is both creative and expressive. I want to tell you about the Boss Beastie, or if you want to call it Towers format. So here's the pitch. You go to your local game store, you see a number of theme and release event decks on the shelf, you and a few buddies each purchase one, you go over to a table, and you open them up. You flip through the cards, you get an idea of what kind of strategy you want to build around, and then you go through the store's bulk bin, or you buy a booster box together, and you start fleshing out these spellbooks. From there, you get to play a game together, a game that gives you guaranteed access to your Boss Beastie, a game that utilizes the Terra that is so unique to this game, and a game that gives you ideas on how you want to further enhance that deck. Here's how Boss Beastie works. Now, unlike Commander, it's not a singleton format, aka you can have more than one of each card in a deck. It's also not going to be a 100-card format. I don't think Metazoo really supports that at this point, nor do I think it's necessary for a good game. But like Commander, something that Commander really gets right is the idea of your commander, who is in a command zone, a zone outside of your deck that allows you to play that card whenever you can afford them. Restrictions are also very important in Commander. You can only play the colors that show up on your Commander card, which means you only have so many cards you need to look at. So these are the rules. Casters build spellbooks based on their chosen Boss Beastie. This comes from either a theme deck or a release deck. There are 10 Boss Beasties released per set, which means every new set you have 10 new options to play with. That Boss Beastie resides in the Caster's Tower, a special zone outside of the arena. They begin the game with all of that Boss Beastie's Terra in play, that being Terra that appears on that Beastie's page. And once they are able to generate enough aura, they can contract the boss from their tower. This sets a thematic battleground that fully utilizes the potential of Metazoo's mechanics and flavor. When you sit down with 2 to 4 players and all of you have your Terra in place along with your Boss Beasties, it does create a very distinct battleground. Now for the rules. Pick one theme or release deck Boss Beastie. Place this in the tower zone to the right of your spellbook. This zone is not considered in the arena. You can contract this beastie as if it were in your chapter. If that Boss Beastie would leave the arena, you may return it to the tower zone. Each time your Boss Beastie is destroyed, you may contract it again from the tower zone for 1 more aura. We're playing around with if it should be 1 or 2, but right now, so far, 1 seems good. Your Boss Beastie is considered part of your spellbook. So for a 40-card spellbook, your Boss Beastie counts in that. So in your actual spellbook, you're going to have 39 pages, and off to the side, you're going to have your Boss Beastie. Terra pages that appear on your Boss Beastie are placed in the arena at the start of your game. You must bring the Terra pages associated with your Boss Beastie, and they are not considered part of your spellbook, though you may play additional copies in your spellbook if you would like. Paul Bunyan comes to mind. You would start the game with the Forest Terra in play. However, Paul Bunyan's attack does benefit from having extra Forest Terra, so you could put more Forest Terra in your spellbook. These Terra can be removed normally. Spellbooks can only contain pages of your Boss Beastie's aura type, pages that reference your Boss Beastie, such as Babe for Paul Bunyan, or Seance's Mancheck cards for the Mancheck Swamp Priestess, and neutral pages. If you are including pages that reference your Boss Beastie, you may play pages of that aura type as well. If you put Babe in a Paul Bunyan deck, you can also put in Frost pages. Now you can only include those extra aura types if you're playing a page with those aura types. For example, with Paul Bunyan, if you don't put in the Brown Mountain Lights, a light cosmic page, you cannot put light and cosmic pages in your Paul Bunyan spellbook. But if you do, knock yourself out. Put in Babe, put in Brown Mountain Lights, run a 4 aura spellbook. Spellbooks must have as many aura pages of each type that the Boss Beastie costs to contract. For example, Morgana, who costs 2 Forest Aura and 2 Spirit Aura, must have 2 Forest pages and 2 Spirit pages in the spellbook. This promotes building around your Boss Beastie and not just building a good stuff deck. If you are including a page that references your boss Beastie, such as Manchac Swamp Sunken Skeletons for the Manchac Swamp Priestess, you are not required to put a water aura in that spellbook, as water is not reflected in Manchac Swamp Priestess's costs. However, it would probably behoove you to do so. If your boss Beastie includes a neutral cost, you may pick an aura type for that cost. So right now we have M, who's the only neutral cost boss Beastie. You can pick an aura type for him. It also means for many of the release event deck beasties, such as Gassian Datha, you may pick a second aura type for that beastie. So with Gassian Datha, it costs 2 neutral, 2 flame. You could make that 2 water, 2 flame, and then put water pages in your spellbook. Only promos pulled from Metazoo's booster boxes, spellbooks, theme/release decks, and blister packs are allowed. We're not doing first anniversary celebrations, New Year's New Beginnings. We want this to be an accessible format, and promos oftentimes aren't accessible. And I'd also like this format to be something people could bring with them to a competitive event to play on the side. And let's face it, your good cards are going to be in your competitive decks. This also is going to affect the meta of the game. No first anniversary celebrations means you need to rely on cards like Toxic Water to remove traits. And that means New Beginnings is probably going to come at a premium, which exists in those theme and tribal decks. Unlike New Year's New Beginnings, where you and your opponent put your chapters in your cemetery and draw 7, New Beginnings has you shuffle your chapters into your spellbook and then draw 7. It's going to keep the life of the game up, particularly if you're playing with 4 players, so you don't all throw your hands away and run through your decks. No copies of your boss Beastie may exist in your spellbook. For example, Gassian Datha has a spellbook limit of 2. In this format, you would not be able to place a second copy in your spellbook. There's also an optional rule that I would encourage you to use, particularly if you're newer and you don't have a large collection, which is the idea of boss aura. So Prism Aura, one of the more expensive and definitely one of the best cards in Metazoo, is an aura that can fatigue and generate any type of aura. This is great for dual aura decks. It increases consistency. If you're playing a water spirit deck, having both water aura, spirit aura, and then a prism aura that gives you flexibility means your spellbook is just going to run better. However, having a $50 to $100 card be a probably necessary 2 of in any of these dual aura boss beastie spellbooks, I think is going to be a little prohibitive. So, assuming that you're opening packs after the Cryptid Nation set, so Nightfall onward, you're going to have token pages. And here's how this is going to work. Once again, optional rule. Take 2 of those token pages, place them in the sleeves in your spellbook. Those pages can now fatigue and generate aura of any type represented on your boss beastie. This means that, say you have 10 aura in your deck and you're playing a dual aura spellbook, you have 2 pages that you'll be able to fatigue to pay for either of its costs. This is another rule we're probably going to develop as time goes by, such as you probably don't want to play those on top of playing Prism Auras. It's probably going to be a one or other, but this format's still in development. We're not looking to ban cards at this point. We'll see if it becomes necessary. But so long as you can pull a card from a booster box or a thing that you can find at your LGS, I think you should be able to put it in your spellbook. If you happen to make like a high power Gassian Datha spellbook with Prism Auras, Possessed Auras, and the new Fusion Auras when they drop shortly, if you're playing with a lot of high power spells, this is where the Commander culture comes in. In Commander, you're usually trying to play spellbooks that are relatively balanced with each other. And if you're playing with more than 2 players, it also gives a little bit more flexibility. If one of those players is just way more powerful than the other 2 are probably going to gang up and knock them down a peg. Because of the no promos rule, that means you can realistically build a lot of these spell books for under $30, right? You can usually find theme and release decks for $10 at an LGS. And from there, you can go through bulk bins, you can buy some product with friends, or you can just buy the singles online as you develop your concept. And as you play this with friends, you're going to find some of those spellbooks are going to be stronger than others, but stronger does not mean a more fun game experience. And it could be you want to bring one of your spellbooks that is fairly balanced against the other spellbooks in your pod. Now on for things that are not rules, but are encouragements. I want to go back to that good stuff concept. So you could pick Paul Bunyan as your boss beastie. It's a forest page. Put it to the right of your spellbook in the tower zone. and then just build a Fearsome Critters deck, which is going to be probably a better Fearsome Critters deck because it's going to have 39 pages and full on ignore Paul Bunyan. You're going to have an incredibly strong and pretty inexpensive spellbook. However, that spellbook's not doing anything with Paul Bunyan, and I would consider that a good stuff deck. It's not that you can't play it, it just really isn't in the spirit of the game. Paul Bunyan has the Forest Terra type. Playing pages that benefit from the Forest Terra is going to create good synergy. Paul Bunyan also allows you to play a variety of pages that take up other aura types, such as Babe. So you could show up with your Paul Bunyan deck that's actually a Fearsome Critters deck, but I don't think that's going to be as much fun as a Paul Bunyan deck that takes Babe and different synergies within the two to create an interesting and expressive play experience. If you want to try this format out, find an LGS that has Metazoo, go with a few friends, and just buy some of these release decks, buy some of these theme decks, and then ideally if they have a bulk bin, just build through bulk, or pitch in and buy a booster box, and then build off of that booster box. I think that will give you a good start. I don't necessarily think it's great to start with just a raw theme deck, or a release deck. A lot of them move slow, and I don't think they're going to ignite the imagination and the possibilities of the game in the way you would get if you constructed the spellbook yourself. But I love the idea of facing 50 to 70 options of boss beasties, of which casters are attracted to which boss beastie, and the kind of spellbooks they build around them. I think it's going to say a lot about you. On top of that, and this is a selfish thing, I want to play more Metazoo at towers, but our brains are fried. Our best cards are in our tower spellbooks. People like holding constructed secrets away from each other, which I don't blame them for, but that means it's just a little harder to find a good, solid game with people at these events. I think if something like this were to take off, you could bring your Boss Beastie deck, and say you get knocked out day 1, day 2, between spectating or at the hotel afterwards, you could play some Boss Beastie games. You know, it's a different format, it's going to have different rules and elements, and there's going to be so many different spellbooks you're going to likely encounter. Let me know what you think about this format. As I said, we're pretty early into development, though we like the rules so far. And as this podcast goes, especially between towers when things slow down, it is something we want to continue to develop. I've heard so many players and newcomers say that they want a casual and satisfying format, and I think this is a good candidate for that. Now, the Earth Tower is coming next month, and we're going to start covering it. In the next episode, I'm going to recount my journey for preparing for the Water Tower, while noting lessons from that experience that I think will be applicable to the Earth Tower. I'm also going to do something a little unusual with Earth Tower deck building with this podcast, but you'll have to listen to the next one for details on that. Thank you for listening. I will put the Living Boss Beastie document in the show notes if you want to click on it and read through the rules. And outside of that, we'll see you on the next one. Towers, a Metazoo podcast, was created by me, Ester Ellis. The cover art was made by Chandler Candela. Music by the Heatley Bros. More details in the description. Want to say hello? Follow the show on Instagram at Towers Podcast. Send me an email at towersgamepodcast@gmail.com and say hi in Metazoo's Discord servers. Many of the figures in Metazoo originate in indigenous lore, and I think it's important for me to acknowledge that I make this podcast on the traditional lands and home of the Tongva Nation. This game presents us with a rich opportunity to get in touch with the living cultures that surround us, and I hope you can take a moment to reflect on the history of the land you stand on and the figures in the cards you play.